There is a town in the California desert with no electricity grid, no running water, no sewage system, and no official government of any kind, where residents have lived for decades on concrete slabs left behind by a demolished military base. Locals call it the last free place in America. 200 miles away, there is a town frozen in the exact condition it was abandoned in nearly a century ago, so precisely preserved that the State Park Service has a name for the policy: arrested decay, meaning nothing gets fixed, nothing gets removed, everything simply stays exactly as it fell. This video counts down 9 real California towns defined by genuine, sometimes extreme strangeness and isolation, documented in state park records, county planning reports, and national news coverage. Several exist completely outside the systems that define ordinary American towns. One of them was bought by a marijuana company, then an oil company, then reverted back to its original owner, all within about 3 years, and it is still, to this day, one of the strangest small towns in the entire country. Stay with me to the end, because the final town on this list looks, from certain angles, like the setting of a low-budget end-of-the-world movie, and the artists who live there built it that way completely on purpose. Let's begin. Deep in Imperial County, 4 miles east of the tiny town of Neeland, sits a place with no address, no zip code, and no legal existence as a town at all. Locals call it Slab City, or simply the Slabs, named for the concrete foundation slabs left behind after Camp Dunlap, a Marine Corps training base, was demolished in the 1950s, leaving nothing but cracked pavement, empty cisterns, and 8 miles of pockmarked roads baking in the Sonoran desert sun. Here is what makes Slab City genuinely unlike almost anywhere else in the country. There is no power grid, no municipal water line, no sewage system, and no rent, because the land technically belongs to the state of California, which has largely left the community alone for more than half a century. Residents generate their own electricity with solar panels, haul their own water, and build their own shelters out of whatever they can scavenge, creating a population that swells to as many as 4,000 people during the winter months and shrinks to a few hundred hardy year-round residents, known locally as year-rounders, when summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees. Slab City has earned its nickname, the last free place in America, but the reality is more complicated than total lawlessness. County sheriffs still patrol regularly, federal and state law still applies, and in December 2019, 4 fugitives hiding among the community were apprehended after a multi-day federal search. What Slab City actually offers isn't the absence of law, but the near-total absence of infrastructure and oversight, a community of artists, veterans, snowbirds, and people simply looking to disappear from conventional society, thriving in a place most Americans would consider uninhabitable. Here's a ghost town that the state of California has deliberately officially decided never to fix. Bodie, high in the mountains east of Yosemite, was once one of the largest and wildest gold mining boomtowns in the American West, home to roughly 10,000 people at its peak in the late 1870s, and infamous enough for its violence that a well-known local phrase of the era supposedly warned children moving to the town: "Goodbye God, I'm going to Bodie." The gold ran out, the population collapsed, and by the mid-20th century Bodie had become, for all practical purposes, a genuine ghost town, its remaining buildings simply left standing as residents drifted away one by one. When California designated Bodie a state historic park in 1962, officials made an unusual decision that separates it from almost every other preserved historic site in the country. Rather than restoring the buildings to their original condition, the park adopted a policy called arrested decay, meaning structures are stabilized just enough to prevent total collapse, but nothing is repaired, repainted, or returned to its original appearance. Peeling wallpaper stays peeling, broken windows stay broken. Furniture and personal belongings left behind by the last residents remain exactly where they were abandoned, some of it sitting undisturbed inside empty homes for more than 60 years. The result is one of the most intact, unaltered ghost towns anywhere in the United States. Roughly 170 buildings frozen in a permanent state of collapse, visited today by people who often report an unusual feeling walking through it. Not because anything is staged for effect, but because absolutely nothing has been staged at all. What you see at Bodie is simply what decades of actual undisturbed abandonment genuinely looks like. Before we go any further, here's the question worth asking. Why does California in particular keep producing towns this strange? The answer is a genuinely unusual overlap of forces found in few other states. California's desert regions, the Mojave, the Sonoran, the high desert east of the Sierra Nevada, cover an enormous amount of the state's total land area while supporting almost none of its population, creating vast stretches of cheap, unregulated, and functionally unsupervised land, exactly like the kind that allowed Slab City to exist unmolested for 70 years. Layered on top of that desert isolation is California's boom and bust economic history. First gold, then silver, then borax, then a dozen other resource rushes that built towns almost overnight and then abandoned them just as fast when the resource ran out, leaving behind ghost towns like Bodie scattered across the state by the hundreds. And running through both of these is something more particular to California than almost anywhere else in the country. A genuine decades-long cultural tradition of people deliberately choosing isolation. Whether that's gold rush prospectors chasing the next strike into ever more remote terrain, or 20th and 21st century artists, survivalists, and counterculture communities specifically seeking out the empty desert precisely because no one else wanted it. California's strangest towns, in other words, exist at the exact intersection of geography that nobody else needed, and a culture that has never stopped producing people determined to use it anyway. Trona sits at the edge of Searles Dry Lake in the Mojave Desert, close enough to Death Valley that summer temperatures regularly climb past 115 degrees. A company town built entirely around the extraction of borax, soda ash, and other minerals from the ancient lakebed beneath it. At its peak in the mid-20th century, Trona was a genuinely bustling industrial community of several thousand residents, complete with its own hospital, schools, and a company-run recreational facility, all built and maintained by the mining operation that gave the town its entire reason for existing. That reason for existing has been steadily disappearing for decades. As the mining operation automated and modernized, requiring far fewer workers to extract the same volume of minerals, Trona's population began a decline that has never reversed, dropping from several thousand residents to fewer than 2,000 today, with entire blocks of company-built housing standing empty, their windows broken, their yards reclaimed by desert scrub. A magnitude 7.1 earthquake that struck the region in July 2019 accelerated the decline further, damaging homes and infrastructure across a town that already had little capacity left to repair itself. What remains today is a town literally being erased by the same industrial economics that built it. A shrinking population, a declining tax base too small to maintain basic services, and a landscape of empty company housing sitting beside the still active mineral plant that continues operating with a fraction of the workforce it once required. A place where the industry that created an entire community may ultimately be the same industry that quietly finishes it off. If you're finding these strange corners of California as fascinating as we are, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us keep making videos like this one. Now, let's keep going. Darwin, California, tucked into a canyon on the western edge of Death Valley National Park, has a population that has hovered somewhere between 30 and 50 people for years, depending on who happens to be counting and when, in a town so small and so remote that many California residents have never heard of it despite it sitting less than an hour from one of the most visited national parks in the entire country. Named after Erasmus Darwin French, a mineral surveyor rather than the famous naturalist his name might suggest, Darwin was once a silver and lead mining boomtown that briefly rivaled far larger settlements in the region during its late 19th century peak, before the mines played out and the population collapsed to a small fraction of what it had been. What survived is a scattered, eccentric community that has become locally known for exactly the kind of independent, off-the-beaten-path residents drawn to a town with no traffic lights, no gas station, and a level of isolation that keeps out anyone not specifically seeking it. Darwin's remaining residents have, over the years, cultivated a reputation as fiercely protective of their privacy, a pattern documented in local reporting on the town that has described a community wary of unannounced visitors and generally uninterested in becoming any kind of tourist attraction, preferring to remain exactly what it has been for decades, a nearly invisible dot on the map, home to a small number of people who moved to the edge of Death Valley, specifically because almost no one else wanted to follow them there. Here's a town that got bought, sold and bought again, and somehow ended up stranger every single time. Nipton, an 80-acre former gold rush town on the edge of the Mojave National Preserve, spent decades as the personal project of Gerald Freeman, a libertarian desert enthusiast who purchased the rundown ghost town in 1985 and slowly transformed it into an eccentric little destination, complete with a restored Old West-style hotel, a trading post, and his own private solar farm supplying much of the town's electricity, all serving a permanent population that never grew much past 20 people. In August 2017, the town's strange second act began. American Green, a publicly traded cannabis technology company, purchased all 80 acres of Nipton for roughly $5 million, announcing plans to transform it into the country's first energy-independent, cannabis-friendly hospitality destination, complete with dispensaries, cannabis-infused spring water, and a marijuana-themed bed and breakfast that internet commentators immediately and predictably nicknamed the Buds and Breakfast. The company built eco-cabins, installed large public art pieces, and began restoration work on the historic buildings, generating national headlines about America's first weed tourism ghost town. The dream did not survive contact with reality. American Green struggled to raise the capital needed to actually complete the project, and by 2018, the company had sold Nipton to an entirely unrelated oil and gas penny stock company for $7.7 million. A deal that also collapsed, eventually returning ownership to Nipton's original family. The town is once again for sale today, still home to fewer than 24 residents, still sitting at the edge of a Joshua tree forest in the middle of nowhere, having briefly been, however unsuccessfully, the most talked about cannabis real estate story in the entire country. On the shore of the Salton Sea, California's largest and most notoriously troubled lake, the small community of North Shore tells a story of collapse almost as dramatic as the lake itself. Built in the 1950s and 1960s as a glamorous resort destination, complete with a yacht club designed by a well-known architect, North Shore once drew celebrities and vacationers to what developers marketed as the California Riviera, a resort economy built entirely around a lake that, at the time, seemed like a permanent and reliable body of water in the middle of the desert. The Salton Sea's chemistry had other plans. Without a natural outlet, the lake has spent decades growing increasingly saline and polluted from agricultural runoff, triggering periodic mass die-offs of fish and birds whose decomposing bodies produced smells strong enough to draw complaints from communities dozens of miles away, while the shrinking shoreline exposed toxic lakebed dust that has become a documented regional public health concern. The resort economy that North Shore and neighboring communities were built around collapsed almost entirely within a couple of decades, leaving behind crumbling mid-century buildings, abandoned marinas sitting nowhere near any actual water, and a population that dropped to a small fraction of its resort-era peak. What remains today is a landscape of genuine, unstaged post-resort decay. The once celebrated yacht club building, boarded and deteriorating, empty streets that were once platted for a housing boom that never fully arrived, and a lake that continues shrinking and growing more toxic each year, a slow-motion environmental crisis that California officials have spent decades studying and so far have not fully resolved. High in the Rand Mountains of the Mojave Desert, Randsburg has survived as one of the few genuine gold rush boomtowns in California that never fully became a ghost town, holding on with a population of a few dozen residents in a settlement that, at its 1890s peak, briefly supported several thousand miners chasing one of the last major gold strikes in the state's history. Unlike Bodie, which was abandoned outright, Randsburg has maintained just enough continuous population and just enough small-scale tourism to keep its original wooden buildings standing and occupied rather than sealed off as a formal historic site. The town's survival has produced an unusual hybrid character. Original 19th century storefronts, saloons, and a general store still line the main street, some of them still operating as functioning small businesses, serving the handful of residents and the modest trickle of visitors who make the drive out specifically to see one of the state's best preserved living mining towns. Randsburg sits close enough to active military testing ranges and remote desert terrain that its isolation has remained largely undisturbed by the kind of suburban sprawl that has swallowed so many other historic California towns closer to major population centers. What makes Randsburg genuinely strange to first-time visitors is the disorienting sense of time travel it produces, a town that looks from its main street almost exactly as it did more than a century ago, populated not by museum staff or historical reenactors, but by actual residents living ordinary contemporary lives inside buildings that have never stopped being used since the day they were built. Bombay Beach, on the eastern shore of the Salton Sea, has become in recent years one of the strangest and most photographed small communities in the entire country, a former resort town whose population collapsed alongside the lake's environmental decline, just like its neighbor North Shore, but which has since been transformed by an unlikely wave of artists into something the rest of California's dying, Salton Sea towns never became. A deliberate, ongoing outdoor art project built directly into the ruins of a genuine ecological disaster. Beginning in the 2010s, a small group of artists began acquiring cheap property in Bombay Beach, drawn specifically by the town's post-apocalyptic atmosphere, sun-bleached, half-buried structures, abandoned trailers, and a beach littered with the bones of dead fish from the lake's periodic die-offs, and began installing large-scale art pieces throughout the town, an initiative that eventually formalized into an annual event called the Bombay Beach Biennale. The results are deliberately, theatrically strange: a submerged drive-in movie theater standing in shallow water, an opera house built from scavenged materials, and sculptures scattered through empty lots and along the shoreline that have turned a genuinely depressed, environmentally troubled town into an unlikely art world destination. Bombay Beach's roughly 200 remaining year-round residents exist in a genuinely unusual arrangement, a mix of long-time locals who lived through the town's resort-era collapse, and the artists and part-time residents who have since arrived specifically because of that same decay, all sharing a shoreline still affected by the same toxic dust and receding water that devastated the town in the first place. It is, by any measure, one of the strangest towns in America, not because outside forces made it that way, but because the people who live there looked directly at the wreckage of an environmental catastrophe and decided deliberately to turn it into art. If you've made it this far, thank you for sticking with us through the full story of California's strangest and most isolated towns. If you found these places as fascinating as we did, please consider subscribing. We cover more of America's hidden and remarkable places every week, and we'd love to have you along for the next one.